Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Security Nurse Podcast. In this episode, I interview Sybil Cummin, a licensed therapist working with victims and survivors of domestic abuse. She has created a nurturing and safe online community for victims and survivors to heal, grow, learn, and find support. Specializing in helping survivors navigate post-separation abuse, she is the host of the Rising Beyond podcast, a platform that offers education, insights, and hope. Her passion extends to her colleagues, and she works to help other clinicians and professionals understand the complex dynamics of domestic abuse and coercive control. She has a wealth of knowledge, and I am grateful to have her on the show today. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to tune in today. It's because of you this show is possible, and it's my passion to bring topics like this to you so that we can build better and safer healthcare communities together. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. The more people we can reach and provide this education to, the more knowledgeable we will be to help victims and survivors of domestic abuse. Thank you again for watching, and be safe. Well, hi, Sybil. Thank you for being here today. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. Doing well on a cold, snowy day where I am at.
Yes. So yeah, you're in Colorado, and so I know that
Yes.
you're getting the snow now. We're supposed to get it later tonight, so that'll be interesting because we haven't had too much snow yet in Michigan. So
Yep. Yeah. Snow here all the time. It's good though.
and then it melts the next day.
Yes, that's the good part, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of miss that about Colorado. I still have like an inch of snow, well, ice now in my yard that's from like 2 months
From
ago.
before. Yeah.
Yep. Well, Sybil, I wanted to have you on today because you work with domestic violence survivors, and that's a topic near and dear to my heart. You and I got to have lunch when I was in Colorado many moons ago. But do you mind just kind of sharing with our viewers a little bit about you, and then kind of what was that aha moment where you decided to start working in this space?
Yeah. So I'm a licensed professional counselor. I run a small group therapy practice, and like early in my schooling, it was like I knew nothing about domestic violence. Even in my graduate program, didn't even get taught a whole lot about domestic violence. And so in the different arenas that I worked, there was a dynamic that I saw within families and literally couldn't put my finger on what it was, because I, like a lot of people, thought domestic violence meant that one partner was hitting another partner or strangling another partner or whatever, physical abuse.
Yeah, severe physical abuse. Yep.
And didn't know a whole lot about it. I was taught in school, like, if there's domestic violence, don't do couples work. And that was about that. Like, I was not trained on like how to assess for it. Like, are they going to tell me? Or is the wife going to come in with bruises? Like, what is actually going to happen? None of that happened.
None of that happened.
That's not how it works. And so, yeah, this dynamic kept showing up, and I like had to learn more about it. And so I started reaching out to other professionals, other supervisors, and domestic violence agencies just to learn more, because I thought like that controlling aspect of things was there. But again, I didn't have the language for it. So it was really me reaching out to other people. It wasn't until I was in my private practice. I'm known for I am a play therapist, so I work with children a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And the county in which I work deemed me good at working with DV. I don't even know what that means, right? Like, but that's what caseworkers would call and be like, oh, we were told you were good with DV cases. Cool,
So
great.
Somehow you got a reputation. Okay.
Great. I don't know what that means. And so just with each family, each case, I just kind of learned about the child's experience. And then because I'm working with the child, I work with the parents. And so I got to see this dynamic in a different way. And so, yeah, I just started getting more and more of these clients. And the real like passion project, why I have really devoted my work as a therapist, I have a community specific for survivors, is because I would be subpoenaed to testify in court for my child clients.
Okay.
And I would share information about like lack of psychological safety, the coercion that was present, the coaching that was present, lack of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like I was talking to a brick wall. Nobody cared. I'm like, hi, everyone. You called me here. You're paying me to testify, and nobody cares what's happening to these kids. At least that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was like, what on earth? Like, what is this? And so I just dove into what it looks like in family court for survivors of domestic violence and their children. And it is horrifying what I found. And so that really is kind of that catalyst of like, none of this is okay. We are not keeping our kids safe, and we're allowing some generational patterns to just continue. And it's supported by the way our larger systems are
Is
put in
set
place.
up. Yeah, I mean, it's real. I think it's my experience going through. I mean, I was very fortunate in my experience, in that I did get full custody of my kids without physical abuse being there. It was
Mhm.
everything but physical abuse. And so I was really fortunate. I don't know if that had anything to do with probably some of my nursing background, being able to document, had some audio recordings and things like that. And then just his own behavior. And then also just the luck of the draw. For whatever reason, I had a magistrate in Colorado Springs that maybe had a little bit more education
Yeah.
than some of the family court magistrates and judges and things like that. It is a big issue. It's a big issue nationwide, that court system. So really fortunate that you're focused on that area and really helping, because I think a lot of people think, okay, once you leave, everything's going to get better. And it doesn't. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It's a really like a long haul, especially when you have children with abusers. So let's back up for a minute and maybe kind of talk about what the different types of abuse look like.
Yes. Yeah, because there is that myth, right, that I even, as a very well, highly educated person in mental health, still didn't know what domestic violence actually looks like. So really the underlying feature of any type of abuse when in domestic violence related things is there's element of coercion and coercive control. So that's a word that's actually now getting some more light shined on it. But this is done through different means. So different forms of emotional and psychological abuse. So it's just the constant kind of belittling of a person, taking away their autonomy and sense of self is a part of all of these relationships. And it's things that on the outside you may not see.
Mm-hmm.
It's that gaslighting. And so really kind of helping, I don't know if that's the right word, but a victim doubt their experiences.
Yes. Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
there's all these elements of psychological abuse. There's this conditioning where it'll be really, really good. And then that allows the bad abusive behaviors to happen without someone leaving because they're so focused on the good times that they hope will happen. And so that's sort of a part of that psychological manipulation and coercive control in that arena. And then there in 98 to 99% of all cases of domestic violence, there's financial abuse, financial and economic abuse. And a lot of people think that looks like the man is working and is the breadwinner. The mom is stay at home and she gets an allowance and she has to track all of her expenses, which yes, that absolutely happens.
Yes.
Absolutely. That is an element of abuse to where one partner, the target partner, has no idea of the finances. They have no way to make money because they are stay-at-home parents or they're not allowed to work. And oftentimes that was done collaboratively with their partner. And so the victim is like, oh my gosh, yes, you're going to take care of me and I get to be a stay-at-home mom. I've always wanted to stay with my babies.
Yes, I was going to say, even when kids come, it starts to get a little bit, I don't want to say worse, but the manipulation becomes that much easier for the
Yes.
abuser to be able to say, we have that's what I encountered a lot of, is that, we have kids now, you should be staying home, you
Yes.
shouldn't be working as a nurse. And then also you're bumping us up to a higher tax bracket and costing us money by working, right? So it's
Yes.
this guilt tripping to help manipulate your behavior and try to change your behavior. And for me, the psychological abuse, I mean, the put downs, I endured it, I think, because work was definitely my lifeline. I was able to feel
Hmm.
successful at work, feel accomplished at work, where I wasn't able to feel that way at home.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's another benefit, right, for someone who's abusive to have you not work anymore, because then you don't have that financial means to leave, but then you also don't have that area where you can feel competent, where you have people that are like mirroring back to you the
Mm-hmm.
amazing parts of you.
Yep.
And so that's another reason why limiting your opportunities to work is helpful. But there's another means of financial abuse too that people don't typically think of, is the victim is actually the primary breadwinner in the family. And they still don't have control of all their money because their partner is overspending. Their partner is opening up loans or credit cards in their victim partner's name. They're ruining credit. They're, living above their means. And the threat of violence or the threat of some sort of violence is present to where that breadwinner isn't going to be able to do anything about it, because if they did, the threat that something might happen is there and it's
Yeah.
believable.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing that we don't necessarily talk about in the psychological physical abuse, is that with the absence of the actual physical abuse, the threat of physical abuse can be just as coercive, just as
Mhm.
convincing to manipulate that behavior,
Yeah.
right? And really scary. It's kind of fear of the unknown, right? They
Mhm.
play off of that fear of the unknown. You don't necessarily have a way to validate or discredit what this behavior is going to be. And so just having the fear, and maybe they even do other things like, punching walls or kind of throwing chairs around. So they show physical aggression towards objects in the house, perhaps,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
haven't necessarily laid their hands on a single person.
Yep. And so you just know that the possibility, like you're not sure what will break them or what will
Mm.
make them do that next physically scary thing. And so that, yeah, that element of threat is underlying all of this as well. And it doesn't have to be a threat of physical violence. It is, well, you work all the time. No judge is going to give you your children.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Right. And so the thought of losing your children, if you mention divorce, is enough for people to stay. And so I think there's that myth too of like, gosh, if this was happening to me, I would just leave. And that there's all these supports available for you to leave. And there's just not. Um,
Not. Mm-hmm.
yeah. And so then some of the other forms of abuse, there is physical abuse. They do use children to abuse. And so they may really try to harm your relationship with your child. It may start small, like, oh, mommy doesn't want us to have fun
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. And then it moves more into really harming that relationship. Spiritual abuse is one that's not talked about a lot, but that is when there's a couple ways this can look. One is like using scripture in a
Mm-hmm.
way to manipulate their victim. And so if there's a lot of different ways that you can interpret scripture of whatever religious readings that you're doing to, ensure that, women are subservient, or that this is a man's role and duty, or whatever it might be. But then there's also an element of spiritual abuse where they kind of strip you of your spiritual practices. Those are stupid. That's not real. That's um, made up in your head. The people at your church are wacko. Then you stop doing those pieces for yourself. That spiritual identity is kind of taken from you. And that's just another area where your identity and autonomy is taken.
Yeah. And I think kind of the general thread and theme through all of these too is shame. So
Yes,
maybe let's
absolutely.
dive into shame a little bit because I think that's a really big barrier. It's a big component that abusers use to
Hmm.
manipulate and control, but then it also becomes a very large component of a barrier to seeking help and leaving and having a more positive perspective of yourself, right?
Yeah.
Self-worth. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it starts to some extent in the myths that we have about who is a victim of domestic violence. So what I've learned over the last, several years and actually doing my podcast and talking with people all over the globe and all over the country is that some of the like what a victim looks like is location and geographical like dependent.
Mm-hmm.
So here in Colorado, if you were to ask some random person on the street to describe a victim of domestic violence, they would likely say an uneducated woman who is socioeconomically low in status. So they are low income. They got pregnant early, so they have lots of kids. They have a blue collar husband who comes home and drinks a couple beers and beats their wife.
Yep.
And that is not like, are there those cases? Sure,
Yeah.
sure, but it doesn't discriminate. So we know that there is a huge range of victims. So if you are highly educated or you come from a air quotes good family, or you have this amazing job, you're financially good, or you're a man, then you being abused by your partner brings up shame just because you don't fit. Like, what's wrong with you
Mm-hmm.
that someone like you would be abused? And so that adds a huge element of shame because the people in the world, the main media shows a victim of domestic violence doesn't fit who you are and who you believe yourself to be. And so that's so humiliating and embarrassing and shameful. Shame also shows up if you have been in a family of origin where shame is kind of the way that discipline or just the way of being in a family of origin of shame, you are more primed to feel shamed by a partner as well. That's kind of an area you go to. And really, if you're listening and you're wondering what is the difference between like I feel guilty and I have shame or I feel ashamed, guilt is I have done something wrong. I can do something different to fix the situation. I can apologize. I can change my behavior next time. Shame is I am wrong. There is something wrong with me versus the thing I did was wrong.
Yeah.
And so the goal of an abuser is for you to take on, I am wrong. There is something wrong with me. I am crazy. I am stupid. I'm irresponsible with money. I'm all of these different things. I'm a horrible mom. I'm not a good wife. And so if it is your identity, then they really have a lot of power over you. So shame is really a big piece and actually something that I've kind of been reading up on and researching and recorded my own episode the other day on this, but vicarious shame. I had never really
Okay.
heard about vicarious shame. And I read about it was mentioned in something I was reading. I was like, okay, let's look at
Yeah.
that. And that is when you're taking on the shame for someone else's behaviors.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Okay, that shows up with all of the survivors I work with because
Mm-hmm.
they are mortified and humiliated about how their partner sometimes shows up. And maybe you're at like a sporting event with your kids and they are yelling at the coach, they're yelling at the other parents, they're cold shouldering your child when they didn't do well in the sport, and you hold shame for their
Their
behaviors.
behavior. Yes. Wow. Yeah.
And so that piece I'm seeing, right, this whole other dimension of how shame shows up in these relationships. But that is actually, I think, really strong for victims and survivors of domestic violence because it's not your behaviors. And yet you've been trained to take ownership that everything is your fault. And
Yep.
your partner's angry, it's your fault. Your partner's abusive, your fault. You should have done X, Y, and Z better, and then you wouldn't have been abused. And so even outside in the community, you're taking on shame that's not yours to carry.
Yeah. Well, and then you may go up to the coach later or say to parents,
Apologize
apologize for the behavior, and you
and
even
excuse it. I'm so sorry. Like, it's been such a rough week for him at work. He's so tired.
Yeah. Yep. And so you take on even more of that identity and more of that shame
Yeah.
when you do that. Yeah. Wow. No, I had not heard of that, but it makes a lot of sense when you bring it up and talk about it. So
Yeah.
thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah. So, what kind of getting into when these survivors start to come to counselors or to healthcare? I've had a couple of instances where, and this was after, as I was leaving my relationship, because I'm one of those people that we started asking the screening questions maybe around in 2009, on our admission stuff in the hospital. And the only question we asked was just, are you physically harmed? Do you feel safe at home? Right. That was the
Mm-hmm.
two. We don't
Mm-hmm.
never got into the financial abuse, never sexual abuse, not any of that stuff. And then, 2000, all the way until about 2015. And 2015 is when I started my separation kind of journey and understanding what the dynamic was. And I was definitely one of those people of like, I'm a nurse. How did I not know this? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how did I not understand the type of relationship that I was in? And then when I went to the local shelter victim services and they handed me the paper of all the different types of forms of abuse, I was like, oh my gosh, I had no
Yes.
clue that there were even all of these different various types of abuse. But even like the coercive control, which, like you said, is becoming kind of more of a newer term that's being used, that's really more of an umbrella. I mean, all of those other forms of
Mm-hmm.
abuse all fall under it's a way of controlling and a way to coerce your behavior and ensure that you behave a certain way. How do we start understanding that a little bit more and identifying that when these survivors come to us as counselors or show up in the emergency room or even like the primary care office?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, right, asking questions is really helpful, and noticing the other behaviors that may show up. Because if there is a high level of fear, they are not going to say they're not safe at home
Right.
because they've been threatened. Like, do not say anything about this. And whether those, it's been overt threats about that, they know. They know if I say something, if police show up at my house, if child protection shows up at my house, I'm in trouble
Hmm.
for what that looks like. And so it really is, I think, establishing that non-judgmental support, because they don't trust many people, because, right, this person that is supposed to be the most trustworthy person in their life has shown to be the least trustworthy. They're not who they say they are.
Yeah.
And so it takes And so it's like building up those other forms of safety, so that when you ask questions, they are more likely to want the support and will answer you honestly. So it's like giving them some time. And shoot, I'm right. I understand the insurance world. And so it's like move people through, like get them through.
Yeah. Yep.
But it really is giving them some time and space and having that non-judgmental stance and just a space of curiosity, right? Like, if
Hmm.
you come into every situation really curious about the person, that feels much better than if you come in feeling like you're the expert in knowing everything about the person in front of you.
I think that that's a really good kind of tip there of not assuming that you know what's going on with this person and taking a
Mm-hmm.
step back and having that curiosity and asking those questions
Mm-hmm.
to kind of get more to the root of maybe what the issue is. And obviously in the ER, I mean, that's a little more difficult where, unless
Yeah.
something is like very overt, child abuse, physical abuse, that sort of stuff, unless it's very overt, it's difficult to really take that time to address some of that other stuff. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, and I start to think of more of maybe the survivor who doesn't know they're in that relationship, right? So
Mm-hmm.
someone maybe
Mm-hmm.
even like me who was in that relationship for 14 years, and it wasn't until that 14-year mark when I finally started seeking out counseling because I was just tired of feeling the way that I
Yeah.
was feeling, which, by the way, was another form that my abuser used. The coercion was, how could I be abusing you? I'm letting you go to counseling. So there's
Right.
comments like that that are being said. But it wasn't until, I started working with that counselor that she started mirroring back and kind of showing me, like, you're in an abusive relationship and this is how it's showing
Mm-hmm.
up. How do you think we can do that with someone who doesn't really fully understand kind of the situation that they're in?
Yeah, I think noticing some of the nonverbals, if you're asking, do you feel safe at home? There's like a rigidity or like a nope or yep, I feel, and it's
Mm,
like, again, being curious about that response of like, I'm wondering, say you are in the emergency room and who's your, emergency contact kind of person. It's like, do you have any concerns about me sharing this information with your partner?
okay, so kind of asking some questions like
Right.
that.
So it's like a little bit of a softer come, to a
Hmm.
similar thing, who makes medical decisions in your family, things
Okay.
like that, because a lot of the families I work with, medical and mental health decisions are not like they're made by one person in that family.
Hmm.
Right. And so it's just asking some of those questions to underlie that sense of control that is present. And again, if it is like an actual medical emergency, we're not actually asking those
Yeah,
questions,
no, we're
right?
not getting
We're going
into
to
that,
take
but
care of. But in some of those, opportunities where the person is able to talk with you, is able to give you the information. And then I think as a provider, to not take their reactions personally.
mm,
So a lot of the clinicians I've worked with, in training them on this are really frustrated because their client lied to them for years, even
mhm.
about their relationship at home, about the abuse, not personal. It is how they are surviving,
Yeah.
right? It is not personal to you at all. They have learned this is what I need to do to survive. This is what I need to do to like gauge trust in this person,
Mhm.
so to not take any of their behaviors personally.
Personal, yeah. And you brought up that building trust, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so in the ER, in the physician's office or mental health counseling, if that person is repeatedly coming back, right?
Yeah.
So maybe with your primary care doctor, they're coming back. Obviously, with a counselor, like you just said, they were working with that person for years and didn't divulge, what kind of
Yep.
situation they were in. What are some of the actions that providers can take to help build that trust and rapport?
Yeah, I think transparency is probably one of the most important elements. So transparency and then giving them agency, right? So
What do you
if
mean
there
by
are more,
agency?
like
Yeah, go a little
allowing
more
them
into
to
that.
make decisions,
Okay.
right? So like if there are more than one decision for a medical procedure, asking them like and being transparent about what you're doing. We know a lot of people that work with survivors or victims of sexual abuse, right? There's a lot of asking and saying what you're going to be doing and explaining the process of
Mhm.
what you're going to be doing. And so all of that is really helpful in garnering trust so that you're not surprising them.
Mm.
Because that, right, if you're surprising someone in a medical environment and they're scared of certain forms of touch or like quick movements or anything like that, their trauma responses are going to just come out. They don't have a choice
Mhm.
about that.
Yeah.
And so that transparency of this is what the procedure is going to look like. This is what this is what I'm going to be doing. Here are your options, A, B, C. What do you feel like, what do you feel about those options? And really giving them some space. They may have no idea because once you've been conditioned for a long time to believe that you are incompetent and incapable of making any decisions that are good, they may not be able to make the decision in that moment, but you're
Be a little,
offering them
like,
that space
overwhelming.
of like, I trust that you can make a decision. And whether, if they're like, well, I don't know, it's like, well, here's my thoughts based on the medical piece. How does that sound? How does that sit with you? Do you have questions?
Mm-hmm.
and moving as slow as you can move. But they very often aren't going to trust their decisions as they're first learning, like that they're in an abusive relationship. And that is one of the things I think that's slowest to come about, is trusting themselves to make good decisions, trusting themselves to make good decisions about other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, yeah, any time we can give them some autonomy and agency over their body, especially if there's been physical or sexual abuse, that is always the way to go.
Yeah. And then how do you, so maybe you're in this situation where the abuser is there too, right? And
Hmm.
so some of the interactions that I've had before, and then even just reading about kind of in my own education and research, is a lot of times the survivor, right? So if you have both of them together, a lot of times the survivor, and even, and this comes from kind of a workplace violence stance too, for like in
Yeah.
healthcare, because that's part of my focus is the prevention of workplace
Hmm.
violence. The abuser will come off as the calm, cool,
Yes.
collected, I'm in control of my emotions kind of thing. And the victim is the one that maybe starts getting verbally aggressive with staff or
Yeah.
and fearful. I think taking a step back and recognizing it as fear and
Yes.
not malice really
Hmm.
aimed towards staff. What kind of recommendations do you have for people that are in that situation?
Yeah. I think anytime you can separate
Mm,
them, like, we're going to be doing a procedure. Can you step out here? We've got some paperwork for you to fill out, those kinds of things. Because even in a counseling situation, even if you're doing couples work and you have like an inkling, like,
mhm.
I need to assess for this further, you're not going to be able to assess super well with both of them in the room. And so having separate sessions. So anytime there can be that separation, and then coming at it from that curious perspective of like, wow, your anxiety really is high right now. I can tell because XYZ. Is
Mhm.
there something we can do to help support that? And then I think just being aware that, people believe that domestic violence is based in like anger management, like they have an anger management problem.
Mhm.
And it's actually the opposite.
Mm.
Usually, an abuser can turn it on and turn it off at the flip of a dime.
Yes. Yep.
And so they can be tearing apart the house, punching holes, screaming in your face, threatening to kill you. Someone rings that doorbell and it is crazy fast how they're like, "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" And they are, cool as a cucumber.
Yep.
And if you're wanting to see like examples of this, so you're listening and you can't quite see it, one of the best examples, unfortunately, that we have is if you search the Gabby Petito case.
Mm.
So Gabby Petito was murdered by her boyfriend, or I don't know if they were fiance or boyfriend, several years ago. And there is video of police contact.
Yes.
And she looks a hot mess. And she's taking blame for anything that has happened. She's looks anxious. She looks emotionally unstable. Cool as a cucumber. And he just is feigning so much care for her.
Mhm.
And so knowing that an abuser, their whole goal is to like create a narrative that for you to believe. And so they will show concern. They also might get you kind of off track. So this is really common in like a couples therapy type session, is there is significant abuse. And this is specifically in heterosexual relationships, male abusing female, but it's pretty common of they go to couples counseling and then the narrative is, ever since she had the baby,
Mm.
I think she might have postpartum depression and anxiety. I'm so worried. Yeah, she's anxious because you're abusing her every day, right? Coercively controlling every move. However, if you are untrained to look at some of the more subtle signs as a clinician, yeah, you do not want to overlook postpartum depression or
Right.
postpartum anxiety, because the realities of that, if that is true, are really high. Right? There's a
Mhm.
high kind of threat potential for the child, for the parent. And so then the whole session is turned to let's fix mom, let's support mom. And then we don't even look at the behaviors of the other partner. And so even, within a medical setting, I guarantee there will be some of that as well, of like guiding the narrative.
Mhm.
so that the medical professionals will look at certain things and not other things.
Yeah, so that coercion even continues, right? It's playing off of kind of those preconceived notions and norms, right? Social norms of
Yeah.
what is expected from healthcare providers, counselors, playing off of that empathy and that concern for wanting to
Yes.
help people and creating that scenario and that situation of she
Right.
really
Right.
needs your help, right? I'm really concerned about this. And not taking the time to really understand or get to the root cause of things, because that
Yeah.
takes
Yep.
time. It takes
Yes.
time to get to the root cause.
Yeah. And something to notice with that is like, are you like the fifth PCP
Okay,
that this
yeah.
person's seen in a couple years?
Mm-hmm.
Because, right, the initial meeting, you may not see it because it takes that time to build that trust. Oftentimes, when someone starts to see it, they'll switch providers.
Mm.
So, like in an emergency room setting, that is a little bit different, right? In our
Mm-hmm.
hospital setting, pediatricians, therapists, primary care, if they, like we call it like therapist hop, if they're therapist hopping, that's something to just pay attention to.
Yeah.
Of why there's been so many providers, right? If they're moving from state to state, well, that makes sense. But if there's not a
Mm-hmm.
reason why it makes sense, it's just something to notice.
Yeah. So it's kind of getting a little too close to
To
the
seeing it.
truth and seeing
Yes.
it, and just not being ready to deal with that and
Right.
tackle.
Right.
It's a huge thing. I mean, it's talking about, leaving these relationships. It's not a one and done. And we said that
No.
earlier on
Nope.
in this episode, that it's a process. It is a
Yeah.
huge process with lots of moving pieces and moving parts. And if you don't have the support or the bandwidth, it's going to be really, really difficult to leave and to
Yeah.
create a new life for yourself. I mean, you're
Yeah.
basically having to create a whole new life for yourself and get to know who you are, right? Reestablish that identity.
Yes. Yep. And even, right, making sure your basic needs are met. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's that layer of safety and healing. And then moving forward and building trust and building your self-worth and feeling competent, and all of those pieces take time. It's the reason that the average number of times it takes someone to leave successfully is 7, because a lot of times it's those basic needs.
Yeah,
They're
that need to be
unable to
met
meet their
first.
basic needs. Or if the post-separation abuse is that bad, they'll go back. Right? If the threat of violence is that high, they might go back. If they're being stalked and monitored, they might go back.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yep.
knowing that, and I think that that's where a lot of people hold judgment, is the why don't you just leave
Mm-hmm.
feel. And so if you, are like this was so long ago. Oh my goodness, like working over a decade ago, but a woman who had very significant physical abuse. There was a huge, scary situation where she was like held and her child was held with weapons and all of the things.
Mm-hmm.
And she managed to escape, and she had physical wounds that were, being tended to in the ambulance. And one of the EMTs said, "Why didn't you just leave sooner? None of this would have happened." Wow, shame,
Yeah.
right? Piling on.
Mm-hmm.
And like some of the work that I did with her in therapy was not about the physical abuse, not the trauma of being held against your will. It was the shame that was put on her later by the people that were supposed to be supporting and protecting her.
And helping. And
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that we don't talk about a whole lot either, and something that I really started to realize about my own situation as I started training more of the security stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and realizing that part of the reason that I stayed is because then you have that inside intel, right?
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, so you know what's happening to your kids because you're there. You feel like you have a little bit more control over kind of actually what's going on in your life
Mm-hmm.
than when you leave. Because when you leave, then
Absolutely.
you have no idea what's going on with your kids when they're visiting your partner. You have no idea what your partner, if they are stalking you, or if they're making arrangements to follow through with some of the threats that they had made, right? So
Yeah.
at least
Yep.
if you're there and you're staying staying, you have a little bit more of some inside information and kind of their behaviors and their coming and going as opposed to when you leave. And I don't think we talk about that a whole lot either when we talk about why people stay.
Yeah, and that your nervous system is actually wired, right, to protect you and to keep you safe and alive. And so you being able to, like, your partner comes home and the way they close the door, your nervous system already, your brain computes, what do I need to do to be safer this evening based on that one teeny tiny behavior. And so your nervous system has been trained to do that. And so when it no longer has that input to make decisions on how to keep you safe, you will feel so much more hypervigilant, right? You will try to maybe like Facebook stalk them or find out information. You may, even if there's an order of protection, right? Because there was a physical crime that happened to you and an order of protection was granted, you may break the order of protection because that fear and that inability to know where their mind is at is so strong.
Yeah. Yeah, the anxiety of leaving is almost worse and higher than staying, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so it takes a lot of time to build and rewire those neural networks to keep you safe in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some other trauma responses that could kind of show up that could alert staff, to that something's going on?
Yeah, I think, right, the most common one that people would think of is that extreme hypervigilance. So you kind of whisk behind them to grab whatever, item you need for the exam or for whatever, and they jump and they flinch and they have a lot of those physical trauma responses in that regard and that hypervigilance. But a lot of the survivors, they may not be in fight or flight. They may be in freeze. And so they may look really shut down, almost flat or glossy. They may be able to talk about the horrific thing that just happened to them with zero emotion. They got nothing. And so I think that we need to look at some of those things too. I think changing stories,
Yes.
right? Like they're inconsistent in their story
Yep.
is something to look at. And again, not be harsh and judgmental, to notice, right? Like to pin that and to be able to say like, gosh, it seems like you're really flustered. And sometimes your story is this and sometimes your story is that. What I need to know to fix you up in whatever medical way, because you don't have the time, I really need to know this. Right? Like you may not need to know the whole story if you're giving them stitches.
Right.
But you need to know enough to know like what item like created the stitches. Was it a fist? Was it something thrown at you? So it's like if they're switching their story a lot or they seem, really frazzled. Again, that more hypervigilance of looking over things. What are you writing down? If they're worried about that kind of thing, it's just, again, something to pin in your mind about that. But I think the thing that's more missed is that flatness and that shutdown, that might be a reaction to abuse because when we don't think we can survive something, fight or flight isn't going to work. We're going to drop into freeze. And so I think that shows up a lot more than people know.
And understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when you're, maybe giving them news on like an illness or something that you just found as well or something like that. And it's just what do I do with this kind of thing, right? And freezing with that. Because I know a lot of the statistics show that there's a lot of physical diseases and different things that happen with domestic violence. The stress of that has physical implications for the body, right? And so they're showing up with GI symptoms, with worsening coronary artery disease because of the stress that's going on. So it's not just like a mental health thing that's happening. It's not just depression and anxiety. It's these other processes that are happening in the body due to the stress of the situation that they're in.
Yes, right. Cortisol in your system 24/7 is not good for your body.
Yeah, no, not at all. I know that. Been there, done that. No, thank you. Not again. Obviously there's your local victim services, things like that. How can we build a support system and help refer patients or survivors to things that are available to them?
Yeah, I think it's hard because the resources are scarce. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places there's a desert when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to resources. Or like literally I got a text today from one of my clinicians that one of her clients tried reaching out to one of the DV hotlines and never got through
Mm.
because it was so busy.
Yeah, I've been hearing more and more of that.
And so that piece is really hard. So I think it is too, if there are other resources that could be helpful in just building up their network. So different referrals for mental health. Again, the domestic violence agencies, like domesticshelters.org. I know they have kind of combined with, I want to say it's like Hope International or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
There,
Okay.
but if you type in domesticshelters.org, their stuff still pops up
Yeah.
if in Google, but it goes every state. There's resources available in every state on
Mm-hmm.
that website. So kind of knowing the larger one, it's like calling 211, you can get a lot of resources,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But so having these larger places so that if you do really need to look, that can be really helpful. I think asking about, do they have a primary care
Mm.
maybe knowing a little bit about the doctors and therapists in your area, because not all primary care physicians are the same. Uh,
Yes. It's
right.
like,
So
yeah.
like knowing this one is very gentle and spends time with people
Mm-hmm.
versus they're a specialist in this. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing a little bit more of those softer skills of the people you refer to, I think is really, really helpful. And then having, resources and different, like even like books, podcasts, different other things that could be available to them, would potentially be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it is so hard because the resources are lower right now. Like
Yeah.
they're struggling. And so that, yeah, it just makes it a lot more difficult. I think potentially, again, depending on where you work, if there's a social worker on site, so
Okay.
hospitals have social workers,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And so it's like, I'm wondering if more resources could be helpful for you, not even saying like you're in your mind, you're like, yes, victim of domestic violence. Like I am 90% sure.
Mm-hmm.
And not saying like, because you're a victim of abuse, I'm thinking, nope, it's like, hey, so I'm wondering if we can set you up with some more resources. Would you like to talk to our social worker?
I like
Because then
that.
you can have that conversation with the social worker, like in passing, like, hey, I'm suspecting some of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the social worker can ask some more of those questions because they may have a little bit more time to do the asking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That really makes a lot of sense. And I like that verbiage, that wordage. I think a lot of times providers, one, the education is lacking, but then two, it's almost like role playing. Like they're really just like
Yes.
tabletop exercises on how do you have those difficult conversations with survivors.
Yeah.
Because I think too, a barrier for professionals is you don't want to trigger somebody, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're suspicious of something, but you don't know what to say because you don't want to trigger something and make them feel bad or cause some distress or anything like that, right? That caretaker part of us.
Yes.
How would
Yes.
you address that?
Yeah, I think if you start noticing, right, in the session, you're asking those questions about where did you get that bruise or what is, going on here? Like your anxiety is not like you've been on meds, anxiety is not improving, kinds of things. And you start asking a little bit more of the questioning and you notice like that, like rigidity, or they're distracting, they're not going to answer you directly, their behavior shifts,
Mm,
right, in some way. Even acknowledging like, wow, that question was really hard. Like I noticed that you really became more hypervigilant, or that question, something about the way I asked that question, because that
mm-hmm,
might be it too. Something about the way I asked that question just landed wrong.
mm,
Right. And so it's again, just giving them like, nope, you are okay. Like, I am not shaming you. I'm not trying to investigate you, but like, I'm really noticing these
Mm-hmm.
things. And I think, yes, having the verbiage is so helpful of like, hey, like, I'm wondering, like you said that you didn't have like a primary care or other kind of social connections within or medical opportunities or resources. Can I set you up with our social worker just to offer you some resources? And so it's something like that where it's like, that feels more gentle. They're not feeling like a spotlight is on them as a victim. It's like all of these resources. And then if you are a medical professional and they are not going to, you like, no, like they're not going to follow through with the domestic violence resources, that can be just like so disheartening. But the more people are giving them options and resources and putting it out there, that's just a drop in the bucket. So
Mm-hmm.
you may not be the drop in the bucket that got them to leave, but you will
Right.
be a drop in that bucket of getting them prepared to understand what they're going through and that they can leave in the future. So I know that can be really hard for therapists who are like, oh my gosh, I just keep seeing, they keep going back. I see that they're not safe. And it's like, we are just a drop in their bucket and giving them the autonomy to do what they are going to do with their life and how to keep safe enough. And then, but you might be one of the reasons. So
Mm-hmm.
not to get disheartened that way, because it can feel that way.
Yeah, and immediately like the visual of the bucket, like right, you take so many drops to fill the bucket before the bucket might actually tip over, right? I think of like the like water parks, kids water parks that has like the big bucket up top,
Yes, it's like,
right?
whoosh,
And then it's yeah, then it spills over. And so I think that's a really kind of hopeful message for providers and kind of understanding like I might not be the
yeah,
drop that tips the bucket over, but the bucket's not going to tip over if no drops are ever put in, right?
yeah,
and
yep,
and and having kind of that confidence in knowing that just being there, listening, helping build that trust and rapport, not having judgment, understanding that the shame of the situation, um and just being a constant, right? So you don't even
mm-hmm,
necessarily have to be the catalyst, but just being a constant in that person's life and how
yeah,
impactful that really is long term, right?
yep, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So wrapping things up, thank you again. I'm so happy that you came on and I really enjoyed talking with you today about all of this and you have so much information and you're a wealth of knowledge. Do you have any resources for professionals that maybe you suggest to get more education and more understanding of how to work with survivors of domestic violence?
Yeah, I think, well, I have a lot of resources on my website, which is risingbeyondpc.com/resources.
Vic, we'll put
There's
that link in the
right.
show notes.
But there's a lot of books and a lot of different opportunities and shorter readings and things on there
Okay.
because I'm busy. Do I
Mm-hmm.
have time to read a whole book all the time? No, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's like learning in little increments, little pocket-sized bits, listening to podcasts that even if you just search coercive control or or domestic violence and just learning those things, like domestic shelters will send just a weekly email with little tips and nuggets
Mm-hmm.
that you can get. So little things like that. And shoot, Google and ChatGPT and all of these things are amazing because if you had a specific question, like, wow, I had a patient come in and they said this and they responded this way, right? What
Yep.
could I have said to support them? And it will shoot stuff out. There's also a really good, if you were in that space and you had a situation that you were like, huh, that was interesting. Amy says, or maybe it's called Ask Amy. I should have known that
It's
before. I
it's
have
it's Amy Says. I actually did an
great.
episode with her too.
Oh, with Anne, great.
Yeah.
Because she has just a quick chat, you can throw stuff in there and it is AI specific to kind of uncover elements of coercive control.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
so if you had a question, you're like, well, I had a really weird situation show up with like this family that came into my office. You can put information from that in that chat and it will tell you if there are elements of coercive control in it.
Yes. Yeah.
So there are a lot of opportunities to just keep learning.
Yep. Yeah. And Amy says is both for survivors and for healthcare professionals. So like
Yes.
you said, it's an AI chat. I've used it. Researched it. It was amazing. And
Yes.
it's like I wish that I would have had that at the time,
Right.
because that would have
Right.
been really, really helpful, because it's filling a gap. Like you said, you had somebody reach out to the national hotline and there was never an answer. And it's not that these people don't care. It's that the
No, they're just so
resources just aren't
overwhelmed.
there.
Yes.
So overwhelmed. It's a huge problem. And so having another resource like is readily available. Robots don't sleep,
Yep. Yep.
but they can be programmed to have very useful information. Thank you for bringing
Yeah.
that up and sharing
Yeah.
sharing that
Yeah.
resource as well.
Yes.
And then, so you have your podcast. So let's hear a little bit more about the stuff
Yep.
that you have going on.
Yeah, so I am the host of the Rising Beyond podcast, and it is part solo, part interviews with different experts and other survivors in the field on all things related to coercive control, domestic violence, but we really do specialize in that post-separation abuse piece. And so if a victim shares children with their partner, they aren't going to be able to go no contact. They will still be in contact with their abuser over time, and they will continue to be abused. And so it looks different. And so that really is what my podcast is for. I hope it's empowering. I do share mental health related, tips as you're healing from it, as well as kind of the logistical, how do you document things?
Mm-hmm.
As well. And it matches the Rising Beyond community, which is a community for survivors, and because of that isolation piece and the importance of having support around you as you heal.
Yeah, amazing. And so your website, is that the best way to find
Yep.
everything? Is
Website
the
is the
website?
best
Okay.
way is risingbeyondpc.com. I've got, the podcast is on there as well. All the resources are on there. Those little nuggets. I've got a lot of blog articles and things like that as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Sybil, for taking your time today. I really appreciate it, and you sharing all of the information that you have shared. I know that our listeners are really going to learn a lot today, and I think it'll really empower a lot of professionals as well to be a little bit more confident in their interactions with survivors. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad we were able to chat.